Is meditation dangerous? It might seem like a silly question. Many people would put meditation on the short list of practices that are essential for good mental and spiritual health. Indeed, we've recommended meditation many times on this show as a powerful tool to use in psychedelic-assisted therapy. Well, in today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we're exploring the situations in which meditation could do more harm than good. We discuss different kinds of meditation, personal and contextual risk factors that could put the meditation practitioner in harm's way, ways to mitigate these risks, research on the potential harms of meditation, and much more. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A couple of announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training and use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the episode with somebody you think might like to hear it. Without further delay, here's our episode today on whether or not meditation is dangerous. Reid, you've never meditated before, have you?
Nope.
We've clearly never talked about meditation on this podcast either over almost 170 episodes.
Yeah, there was a book that came out a few years ago called Mindfulness. Did you ever read that?
No. It's a great title.
Yeah. It's become, of course, I mean, it's an understatement, a buzzword, a hot topic, a big industry, which has its beautiful positives and also, a bunch of potential negatives that people could find in the growth of anything at that scale. It's
really kind of weird to think, right? You've got you'd be hard pressed to find a therapist who won't recommend meditation of some kind, or your favorite Instagram influencer. You've got the apps like Headspace and Calm that have millions and millions of users. We've talked about Sam Harris's meditation app a lot. We also talk about meditation as a great way to prepare for psychedelic therapy,
if not a mandatory
preparation
task,
or to be used in integration, to revisit insights or get present with the body and understand the mind in context, and all that stuff that we talk a hell of a lot about on this podcast.
So listeners, if we were to tell you that we were going to talk today about the risks of meditation, how would that land? Or what would be the most common response, do you think, Steve?
Probably that.
What are risks?
A gasp.
Are there?
Are there risks? Can meditation be dangerous?
Yeah. Because you're right, it is dished out so broadly as a one-size-fits-all solution. And we love meditation, mindfulness, but it also means a hell of a lot of different things. And so I think we both feel like it's important to... or fun to discuss that. We like to, let's be honest. On this show, we like to meander through things we like to meander through, right? And one other reason for talking about this today is my oldest son happens to be right this very moment at time of recording on maybe day 8 of 10 of a silent meditation retreat.
Yeah,
his first one. Yeah. And of course, I have no idea how he's doing, because it's a silent retreat and you turn your phone in at the beginning. And as a parent, of course, you worry about your kids. And I have wondered countless times, how's he doing? What's it like? Oh, is it hard? What's the hardest part? How's he doing now?
Right.
And so not that I have real concrete concerns, right? If I'm balancing all the typical worries and overthinking and irrational things that might come up. But there is some validity to that question in general, right? About especially intense meditation. That's maybe distinction number one is there's a big difference between busting out your calm app for 10 minutes and doing a meditation or doing a 10-day silent sitting retreat.
Yeah, that distinction is important, I think, at the top of the show here, because we'll say meditation, and that's actually a really broad umbrella term under which a lot of different practices will fall.
Everything is meditation in the end. Like it's spoken about that way sometimes.
Yeah, bringing mindfulness or mindful awareness to everything that you do, to eating, to walking, to breathing, to conversation. You could think of meditation as an attitude or a stance that you take, or a filter through which everything passes, right?
Yeah. It's not that dissimilar to, let's say, psychotherapy is something broad. Maybe I'll put that in your court, to get your thoughts on, is like people often may recommend therapy so broadly without thinking that there are adverse effects potentially, or risks. But what's your take, Steve?
Yeah, even that term, psychotherapy, can mean so many different things because there's so many different ways to do psychotherapy, or to say that something is therapeutic, right? Like, go for a run, it's therapeutic. In the context of psychotherapy, your therapist could recommend going for a run. Is that a psychotherapeutic intervention? And then there's all these, like I'm implying, there's all these, like, you could go to therapy and you can get somebody who's giving cognitive behavioral therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy or internal family systems therapy. It could mean a lot of different things.
So then if we limit the discussion to, are there risks, or the question, are there risks of starting a course of weekly hour-long psychotherapy with a licensed psychotherapist?
Yeah, there definitely are. And it's been studied, like with any treatment, right? There's always adverse events or serious adverse events, which we can get into. But people sometimes are destabilized by therapy. And that's excluding sort of therapists who are bad actors or who could be accused of malpractice, like not assessing the client well for appropriateness for that particular therapy, or even, to be more charitable, just understandably making a mistake and it being harmful. Or, even if everything is done, quote unquote, right, and therapy for trauma, for example, brings up something that's very destabilizing, and then the client decides not to come back, and then they're sort of left harmed by their therapeutic experience.
Yeah.
There's lots of potential harm.
Or destabilized, and it has long-lasting consequences in someone's life. And you could fill in the blanks with anything from like losing one's job or XYZ, or harming oneself, things like that. And trauma is a good example, because that's an example of a psychotherapy that I think is well recognized, widely recognized, that there are potential risks of engaging in a course, and one needs to be ready and prepared, or at least on solid ground as defined by XYZ, or at least by having these supports in place in order to forge ahead, managing those risks.
Yeah. Another example I'll give, I can't remember exactly what it's called, like critical incident stress debriefing, something like that.
Yeah.
Where this was a therapy they thought would be helpful. And this was, as quickly as you can after a potentially traumatic event, debrief with those people that experienced the event. The idea being it's psychological first aid. And then as they deployed this therapy, the follow-up research indicated that actually the people that got it were worse off than the people that didn't. That there's some natural process that needs to unfold that doesn't involve a therapist inviting you to focus on what just happened. That can actually help you metabolize a potentially traumatic experience.
Yeah, and it could have been something so simple as how it was delivered. Like it could have been one protocol tweak could make all the difference in, we see that in clinical trials in general, whether it's a drug or a therapy or any intervention that's being tested, just like in other specialties, like this artificial knee, version 1 might not have worked. Version 2 maybe did. Right.
Yeah. And then you have therapies like conversion therapy, where, people presenting who were gay, for example, and because of maybe some social cultural pressures, they didn't want to be gay. And so they saw therapists who were trying to help them.
Or their parents or their...
There you go.
Yeah, culture.
Yeah. And so these therapies were designed to change people's, quote unquote, sexual orientation. And of course, did tremendous harm. And now conversion therapy is considered malpractice.
And banned. Yeah. So that's kind of some context.
Right, some parallels to other things.
And so why talk about this is because we're fans of truth and like the best damn information we can pull on a topic to present a balanced view, right? And so we can all proceed with awareness and caution and take a compassionate, careful, individualized approach to these kind of things.
Right.
And definitions help us sort out some of these confusing points. Like some article might say, or some podcast series or whatever, beware of the perils of meditation. And then the other article or the other 1,000 I'm going to say, there are all these far-reaching benefits backed by science. And as with probably every one of our other episodes, we also like to point out that often more than one thing can and is true.
Right.
Can be and is true.
Right. And I'm glad you pointed that out. When we did our sort of research episode, we were talking about how to interpret, metabolize research. We also made that point that a lot of times if you're getting your information from headlines or an article written by a journalist, then sometimes you're getting the most sensational and often without context or important nuance picture of something. So if you see a headline that says meditation is dangerous, that's clearly missing some important nuance, but it makes an important point that's worth paying attention to. So what are the scenarios in which meditation could be dangerous?
Yeah. And maybe just to revisit that research topic for a second here, with regard to meditation, and I think it's also relevant to our recent discussions about the MAPS Lycos FDA decision and some of the challenges in psychedelic clinical trials. But clinical trials in general, the FDA requires that serious adverse events be reported. But practically speaking, in pharmacology trials, all adverse events are collected and the serious ones are reported to the ethics board and these other, agencies or groups, internally, externally. But all the other ones are carefully collected from both the placebo group and the drug group or intervention group. If it's a randomized controlled trial, you're still going to collect them in the open label trials without that comparator group, for example, but you're not able to make that same comparison, right? But in the end, when you get a drug approved, there's a package insert that comes with it in the box of the drug, and everyone's probably had their hands on many and read zero of them in entirety, right? But I like these things. I mean, it's in part because clinical trials is what I do. Like I've been doing them for 15 years and we work together on the psychedelic clinical trials, and I'm still involved in some of the standard drug trials where it's a really interesting thing to get hands on with. So in the package insert, you will have a table that shows the adverse events that showed up most commonly and more in the drug than in placebo. And then you'll usually have a column of if you took 100 milligrams of Imitrex or a placebo in these studies, here's what happened. And headache's not the best example for Imitrex. Let's say nausea would be listed at a certain percent in the drug. It might be 12% get nausea on the drug, and I'm making up these numbers, 5% on placebo. And so then you kind of know what to expect. But that's kind of big picture. But when you look at the explosion of mindfulness research and the fact that it means a lot of things and is not... it's not only not a medicine, but it's not limited to formal licensed psychotherapy. It's not a clear-cut, protocolized intervention in and of itself. So it just hasn't been systematically tested. And as the field grows, some studies are and more need to, but that's kind of where we're at. I think it's even John Kabat-Zinn, Harvard mindfulness guru, mindfulness-based stress reduction is stated that, yeah, the vast majority of these research studies are subpar at assessing these things. Like we need to clinically when something is rolled out at scale into everyday mental health care, let's say.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Like your Calm app doesn't come with a package insert. And, when you were describing that, it made me think of those just head spinning pharma commercials that you get. Like, try this drug that's going to take your allergies away, may cause blindness and rage and diarrhea. And it's this long list of things that just sound horrifying. So, and of course the people on the screen as you're listening to all these terrible side effects are dancing with joy because their problems have gone away from taking this drug. So, and I guess it's the adverse events, serious adverse events that were discovered in the trials that inform that wild list that we see on those drug commercials.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a definition, usually of what and how it needs to be reported. It's a highly regulated industry when it's a drug now, of course. And so like a typical table you might see when you're looking at these kind of things might say, these are the side effects that show adverse events or effects that showed up in more than twice the placebo.
Right.
And are the most common 20, because we're not going to list 1,000.
Yeah.
But the plot thickens here with meditation because, well, maybe it might help first to not yet go down that rabbit hole, but let me just read a couple summaries of studies that might get the wheel spinning a little bit.
Yeah.
Like in 2022, sample of 950 people in the U.S. who were meditating regularly, over 10% experienced adverse effects, which had a significant negative impact on everyday life and lasted for at least 1 month. So they experienced adverse effects which had a significant negative impact. I'm going to get into that more, and then there was a review in 2020 looking at 40 years of research, looking at anxiety, depression as potential semi-common adverse effects, but rare ones included psychosis, delusional symptoms, dissociation, depersonalization, fear, terror. And the research has shown that people, while this is more common, those serious ones and people with a history of mental health diagnoses, certain ones in particular, they also showed up in people without a known history of those kind of things, right? And to those who only had moderate exposure to meditation, one of these studies was saying, because we're trying to make a distinction of there's an intense meditation and there's a 5-minute easy one that they would have very different risk profiles or side effect profiles on their package inserts. But what about everything in between?
Right. Yeah. And so in your sort of perusal of the research, it isn't clear that they're not operationalizing meditation very clearly. Like, are they studying is the group prescribed a 5-minute meditation or?
Yeah, so there's that part of it, but the other thing I wanted to point out that even muddies the waters a bit more is in meditation, you're told to turn towards the discomfort.
Right.
Like meditation, to my knowledge, doesn't cause chronic pain, right? But you could see how along the way in one's meditation practice journey, if you have chronic pain and you're meditating, trying to learn to maybe work on your relationship to the pain and your experience of the pain and your emotional reaction to the pain and all that. There are these things we talk about of sometimes you feel worse before you feel better. Not everything works for everyone, for one. And the only way out is through. You got to feel it to heal it. In meditation, I have this stance of like turning towards the discomfort. And how does that show up if you're asking a question to someone the next day of, do you have discomfort? Is there any in your life? What if they just happen to be oblivious to it, numb to it, unaware of it previously, and maybe unaware of some of the positive things in their life?
Yeah. So maybe like a mediating variable here is cognitive appraisal. How do people
Yeah.
think about what they're experiencing? Kind of like you're saying is, and we could also talk about the difference, which we've discussed in the podcast before, but of an emergence versus an emergency, psychological or even spiritual emergence versus an emergency has a lot to do with your appraisal of what's showing up.
Yeah. Yeah. And so while mindfulness meditation does have this nice definition of a non-judgmental compassionate awareness to the present moment and everything that's going on. With mindfulness, that means the aim is not to suppress the negative stuff, it's to allow. Like that's a common, meditation term, allow or turn towards. And, of course, these do, as many people might be thinking, apply to the psychedelic experience as well, because meditation mindfulness is a state of consciousness, depending on how you define it. I like to look at that. Part of it is that it can be that looked at that way. And we're a fan here of altered states for altered traits, right? A psychedelic experience, for example, on purpose, occasioning an altered state of consciousness, perhaps a mystical one, perhaps just a really difficult one too.
Yeah.
Often both, in order to bring about lasting change. And meditation, I think, is the same thing on like maybe a different, digested differently in small increments, in a slower path up this mountain, perhaps slower even in a 10-day retreat than a 1 hour bufo session.
Right. Yeah. Certainly slower than that. Right.
Yeah. But I know, there can be 10-day plant medicine retreats.
There are other things that happen, on these, for instance, these 10-day retreats. I in my research, I came across this story, I guess, that was told in a podcast series about Goenka, Vipassana
big podcast,
retreats.
right?
Yeah, it was Financial Times, I think, did it. The Untold, the Retreat podcast series from Financial Times.
Exposing the perils and dangers of going into wellness retreat or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the majority of people that come out of these retreats do well and go back and find them useful. But there are these fringe cases that are important to pay attention to. We don't want to assume that because there are these terrible stories that it paints the entire retreat with that brush. But I mean, the stories were pretty harrowing. These are people, and I'm not familiar with those Vipassana retreats very much, but apparently there is a screening process, and they don't just let anybody in, and apparently they're pretty expensive. But people go for a 10-day silent meditation retreat, and they're put on a fairly strict diet. They wake them up in the morning at 4:00. They're meditating pretty much all day. And they take their keys and their phone away. And there were a couple of people that got really destabilized. Some people even, there were a few reports, the more harrowing ones, where people took their own lives afterward, or maybe were hospitalized for psychotic breaks.
Especially, you can imagine it could happen anywhere. Tragically, it's frightening, in fact, but you could see how it could even be riskier in times past, or traveling to a far off land where you really do surrender to the process. And the process, I think anyone going into a long, intense sitting in silence is going to have perceptual changes come up.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
Like, it's expected, and
you're going to encounter stuff that maybe you've been ignoring. True.
Yeah, like I have encountered things like that countless times in yoga and meditation practices. Often not the average, like, short yoga or meditation class down the road, but sometimes. But often when you're doing something repeatedly, intensely, or you're sitting with yourself for a long time and feeling, I mean, that's, one of the biggest fears of many people is like sitting with your own thoughts, nowhere to run or hide.
Right. Yeah. One of the reasons I brought it up is not just because of what you described, like sometimes just sitting with self for a long time can stir things up, but it's the other austerity like the other sources of austerity in some of these retreats that, also, to use your phrase, muddy the water. So in these retreats, if they're meditating, stuff comes up and they're not sleeping, we have sleep deprivation, or the change in their diet if they're really, really hungry.
Yeah.
If there's like people going to these darkness retreats too, where that can, limiting that kind of sensation can really stir things up for people.
And the
physical pain of sitting all day and
the people holding the container make all the difference, right?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned something about screening and whatnot, and hopefully there's good screening. There hasn't always been, and there's a risk for not screening nearly as well or at all for something like a meditation retreat compared to a medicine retreat, because we just assume that because you're not taking something in, it may not have some of the same risks. And but yeah, the thing is, then you have people who have this stuff come up, and in a silent retreat where you have one chance to speak out loud to a teacher during a certain day after you're waiting in line, and the whole thing is trying to make you sit with your impatience and other discomforts, and it's just all getting compounded, and you're looking around and you can't talk to others and relate about an experience necessarily. Am I the only one going crazy? Am I alone in this? And you could spiral. Yeah.
And that's one of the criticisms I read about this particular retreat was that, often the answer to I'm in distress was meditate more.
Yeah. You're not doing it right, or you gotta, you gotta keep
in
going.
and through. And we've talked about the scenarios in which that's the helpful advice, but for some of these folks, they needed to be helped.
Yeah.
And more meditation wasn't it.
Yeah. So one thing struck me years ago. It was probably over a decade ago when I first got kind of more and more immersed in meditation, different types of meditation, and working in a number of ways on bringing it into clinical practices, including, even some, academic projects like at the VA hospital, psychiatry, and other areas where looking at how to apply this. But a couple of things struck me is, one, how hard it was to get people to sit still for a certain amount of time daily. And for lots of reasons. And and then the other thing is how many people responded when you bring up the word meditation of like, oh, I can't meditate. Oh, my mind just goes crazy. Like I've heard that more than I've heard any other answer or reaction to it. And they're not saying my mind goes crazy in a, like I went psychotic and had to go to the ER. In those situations, it's more just kind of highlighting that this isn't easy.
Yeah. Restlessness, lost in thought.
There are things that will come up. It is part of the process. And we also need to acknowledge that and be compassionate and understanding and prudent and wise about what we do with that. Yeah.
And maybe that's a potential risk here with meditation is if people aren't properly prepared or educated about what meditation is, right? It's not about emptying your mind necessarily. And there are different forms of meditation.
Yeah, good luck emptying the mind.
Yeah.
Right? Just, I know it's a term, but yeah.
But that could lead to some unnecessary distress and possible destabilization for somebody if they've been improperly educated about what they're supposed to be doing here or what the purpose of the meditation is.
Yeah. Yeah. So some of the literature, there are a few papers, I think, that you and I both came across when doing a perusal to make sure we've got the most up-to-date information. A few papers that do a good job of calling out this issue, the confusion and the need for consensus and good solid reporting going forward. But yeah, it's those papers, they're just like when you read about how, like, it makes sense, but the path forward is not easy, right? These studies, in order to be really conclusive, need to be forward-looking, need to have a control group. And who's going to fund it like someone's going to fund a drug that has patent protection in our society, given how the economics are, right?
Right. So given that that's the case, do you want to sort of just turn to a PSA about some of the things that can make meditation unsettling for people? We've covered a few of them already, but what could potentially make meditation dangerous for folks?
Or what might come up? What are some of the experiences? But I think we can draw from our clinical experience here, including and especially with altered states in psychedelic therapy.
Right.
In fact, I had a client earlier today who was telling me about her experience with ketamine treatments in the past. And while saying these were positive, helpful, but her experience was that as soon as she went into that state, she became terrified and would scream. That's not the most common. That's definitely not the most common response on ketamine,
Right.
but it's definitely also not the only time I've seen it or heard about it. And so one of the reasons for that, and the reason she attributed, was her history of childhood trauma and some other kind of recent big stressors. Reminds me of the this Ram Dass quote I read once, because he wrote these books, and there's a movie about it called Becoming Nobody. Like his journey from Dick Alpert to kind of losing himself so he could find himself, and his whole journey has this beautiful story of becoming nobody eventually. But he points out that you've got to become somebody before you can become nobody. And you've got to have some solid ground, just like we were talking about in going into trauma work in general, especially if you're turning on that with a medicine or an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah. So I guess maybe you're saying if you're going to do meditation, and the meditation is going to put you in touch with some things that are maybe subconscious, or at least things that you're understandably avoiding, that it might pay to understand what that could look like, what that could feel like for you, or that at least to know that if you are unfortunate enough to have a trauma history, that doing meditation could bring you closer to the fire of your previous trauma.
It's like we were talking about with shadow work on a semi-recent episode, is like even the term shadow work implies going into the dark corners of yourself where there is stuff stashed away in the dark corners of you, often for a reason, and sometimes that reason might be that it was stuff that was too difficult to handle at the time, and protectively kind of walled off for a time, with the wisdom of ourselves and our bodies and how we can make it through tough times.
Yeah. So maybe if that description kind of fits you, and you want to start your meditation journey, the first place to start might not be a 10-day silent meditation retreat, right? It might be 5 minutes of the Calm app, or it might be 5 minutes of just sitting in silence, following your breath.
Or it might be with a teacher, a guide, a clinician.
There you go.
It might be with a mindfulness-based group program. Like a common protocol is this 8-week, 2-3 hours a week, clinical benefits reported out in the literature. Some adverse effects should be reported if they're not, because there will be some, but the common ones are part of the process. It's kind of the same thing when I'm doing the informed consent process before ketamine or Spravato, S-ketamine, for example. We're making sure people know what to expect. And so they have all the information, can make a decision. Do I want to take on the risks for the potential risks for the potential benefits? And, I take this stance personally of there aren't necessarily good, bad in this category. It's like there are effects of an intervention, a drug, or a practice in this case, and there may be like a hallucination that comes up during a psychedelic therapy dosing session is treated vastly different than a hallucination that comes up for someone out in the world who's having their first break of schizophrenia, right? Like to give an extreme example. And in clinic, we're often wanting some of these effects of a drug to come up. One, because we might be using that. Two, it might be a sign that this medicine is doing something in the individual on the path to progress. Yeah. So going into it, just being aware of that, and having a good support or someone you can talk to about it, and also just knowing if there's a significant history of mental health struggles in the past and or a significant history of trauma, as two examples that might be more likely to you might be more likely to encounter some difficulty as you're venturing down into the subconscious and beyond on your journey,
Right.
Yeah.
So knowing those things, proceeding with caution, go slow, and do it with support.
Yeah. Yep. And I like how Shinzen Young talks about it. I've mentioned this before on here, but I think it's been a while, so I'll self-allow it.
Oh, yes.
It's in his book, The Science of Enlightenment, talks about this 3-layer cake analogy of consciousness, and on a meditation path, for example, you're going from the surface layer, the icing of the cake that we're sitting on right now, in this metaphor. You're going down into the next layer, where you might encounter some interesting things or some scary things, or both. Like, it might be, oh, that's curious. I didn't know my mind works like that. Oh, isn't that funny how my mind wanders this much? Or, whoa, I'm having this perceptual change. The light is sparkling, whatever's happening. Or you might encounter some past hurts and unshed tears and unhealed grief and pain, things like that along the way. Both potentially important things to work on your path towards the deeper layers of this cake would be like your higher self or source, depending on how you're viewing this thing in the journey. But I think everyone does have to go through the psyche in some ways, and everyone will encounter something different, and it can be viewed as either obstacles, distractions, impediments along the way. But how we hold people through that process, how we prep them for it, and what we do with that stuff we encounter matters.
Yeah. So maybe other points about helping people prepare and helping people move through what might be, depending on the appraisal and depending on the outcome, either an important struggle or could be an adverse event that does damage.
Yeah.
We talked about cognitive appraisal. Something we've also discussed on the show before is made popular by Carol Dweck, but the idea of a growth versus fixed mindset.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we talk about potentially traumatic experiences, the emphasis isn't on what happens, it's on what happens next, that can result in whether or not that event was traumatic. So maybe, let's say you're a therapist and you're going to recommend meditation to your client. You might want to have a discussion around that, right? So if something difficult comes up, how do you typically think about difficult experiences in your life? Are they opportunities for growth? Do you feel like that they are evidence that the hopeless state of your life is unchanging and unmutable?
Like if I had a little bottle of Sananga eye drops in my pocket and I sneak up behind you when you're in a
Sananga ambush,
important meeting, and I drop some in your eyes and you're screaming, and I laugh and I run away. And you never want to do that medicine again. And
right.
You had the worst work day of your life or something.
It would put a strain on our relationship.
Yeah, it would. Yeah. We've got a fracture now. The podcast is in peril.
That's right.
Or if I said, Steve, you want to do this cool thing? We're going to hold your hand throughout, and you say sure, and everyone's cheering you on, and we're high-fiving and hugging after, and you're like, that was crazy, and I made it. It's different, right?
Yeah, that may or may not have happened at one point. Yeah. Well, another way to think about this is let's say you are exercising, you're doing your high intensity interval training, your heart rate's through the roof, you feel like you're going to die, you're going to puke. And after you're done with your CrossFit workout or your hot yoga session, you're like, yeah, this discomfort that I experienced is making me more fit. There's context there. But if you're driving your car down the freeway and all of a sudden you experience all those physical sensations.
Your heart is 160 beats a minute on the freeway.
You think you're going to die, that you panic for a good reason. So exact same physiological state, different context. It makes the complete difference here. So you can imagine that with meditation. If you've like we're talking about, if you have sufficient preparation, you kind of know what to expect. I say kind of because you can't totally know exactly what's going to emerge, like we've discussed with psychedelic journeys. So then when you're sitting in silence and you've inducted into this meditation practice and you experience some discomfort, physical, emotional, or otherwise, like, oh, maybe this is that thing that my therapist told me it might benefit me to turn toward instead of it being some kind of surprise or emergency.
Yeah, and I think that's a good description, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about where meditation comes from. Like, say, the Buddhist and yogic traditions talk about these kinds of practices, called a lot of different things, as a path to self-realization, to this place of liberation. But there are obstacles to the path that are well described often in these texts. Like, even I can think of a couple texts from Buddhism and yoga that are, at least 1,000 to 2,000 years old, that talk about these kind of things. That I think, looking at it now, is pretty astute. Like, you may encounter these things. You can see how someone might, like, a really hardcore teacher. Like, I've been in meditation environments where they come around and smack you gently with a stick, right? But where hardcore teachers are really pushing you to stay with, and you can see how for some that might be too much too fast. But it does. You see where it comes from, and I do believe there's something to it. Just like in that, my therapist told me this is what I might encounter. The obstacle is the path, or triggers are friends to follow. We're talking about triggers and obstacles here, and we're talking about pacing ourselves and being able to move through a course of some kind of growth without getting overwhelmed and crashing and burning.
Yeah, right. And maybe in that preparation, you talk about, resourcing strategies. We talk about this with our psychedelic therapy. Like we actually teach this a lot in our training courses on how to do psychedelic assisted therapy, but so that people don't feel completely helpless in their meditations, where even though you've told them X, Y, or Z might come up, X, Y, or Z comes up, and they could feel totally lost. So you have some resourcing strategies, a bit of a parachute, not the least of which could be just come back and talk to me about it. But, if it gets too intense, in the spirit of go low, go slow, open your eyes, squeeze your hands, get up and walk around. That's okay.
Yeah.
We don't have to approach this with all the vim and vigor of somebody in BUDS training to become a Marine, right? It's okay to pace yourself a little bit and use those resources.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of all the times we've had groups, retreats, trainings, and guided a group with a brief meditation, like countless times, right? And in those situations, like if I'm thinking of all the 5 or 10 minute beginning of a group or workshop meditation I've dished out, there hasn't ever been like a serious event that's emerged during one of those for me. I mean, but, if I look at even breath work, where I've either been a participant or helping hold space, I can think of, there are more occasions than I could count of needing to sit with someone, perhaps outside in the other room, to help them through something really intense that came up. And at least in breath work, as an example, you can kind of self-titrate. That isn't always the case on, say, a psychedelic journey or or isn't always the case if someone's maybe thrust into the wrong setting without the support in a far off place, for example.
Yeah, you bringing up breath work is another good example of, the dose and the type matter.
Yeah.
Right. So breath work is a kind of induction or into an altered state of consciousness, and it could be said as a type of meditation, but you're doing something. The technique that you're doing maybe has a higher likelihood of causing what might feel like an adverse event. So all those things we're saying about preparation and support and resourcing are really important with something like that.
And at the risk of making this the most confusing episode ever, I'll just further complicate by saying, like, breath work is fun to poke at as well as an example, because I just last year, I think, published with some colleagues a paper on, were you on this paper, Breathwork Interventions for Depression and Anxiety? We did a systematic review of the literature, and the title Breathwork is in this peer-reviewed published paper, but most of what we extracted as far as studies that we could include in this meta-analysis, if you will, were not the holotropic or 90-minute breath work. Also means pranayama practices, or like what some people like Leah Lagos might call resonance breathing in her Heart, Breath, Mind book. And breath control means a lot of different things. And there's a very different risk from 90 plus minutes of hyperventilating versus slowing down your heart rate your respiratory rate to like 5 breaths a minute for 15 minutes.
Right. Most of what I'm thinking of now sort of just falls under categories we've already touched, like this idea of appraisal, of trying to figure out the difference between an emergence that could be useful or an emergency where you need help. You might even seek medical attention. You made the great point about turning toward discomfort and what can come from that, right? The positive effects from doing such a thing. What else? What else is there to say about meditation potentially being dangerous and how to mitigate those risks?
Well, one little resource that I'll point out, with the disclaimer that I just recently stumbled upon this, and I don't know it intimately well, but some people who've experienced challenges from meditation practice in the past have banded together, and this is in Europe, but they made a resource. I believe it's under a nonprofit endeavor called meditatinginsafety.org.uk. And so there are resources like that have some, free articles and book chapters and things like that, and discussion forums, but where people can go and ask. So that's one potentially useful thing to throw out there.
Yeah. Way to go sharing a resource. I guess the final thing I'll say is, of course, meditation can be incredibly beneficial. We've pointed that out ad nauseum.
Are you saying that this episode isn't a warning to cease all meditation activity immediately?
We have the scoop. We're the whistleblowers for the meditation community. No.
Microplastics next time. And I'm not trivializing our ecological crises out there, known and unknown.
Microplastic epidemic.
Yeah.
But like we said at the top of the show, all of the things that we recommend as therapists, whether it's psychedelic related or not, for you and me working in the psychedelic space, come with disclaimers and need to be approached with caution and wisdom. And you and I just happen to be wired this way, that I guess I'll speak for myself. But when I get really excited about something, it sets an alarm off real quick to be like, okay, you're getting excited about this. Are there reasons to be cautious? Are there reasons not to be, too bullish on this?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Well, that's all I got for today.
All right. We squoze Reid dry. Thanks
for
everybody.
humoring the meandering, Steve. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.